Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I am grateful today to join my colleagues as we continue to sound the alarm about the ongoing serious threat to our democracy. This is a perilous time. And I want to thank Senator Klobuchar for her leadership on this issue and all of the rest of my colleagues who have been so eloquent tonight, and I know will be eloquent tonight, who are here today to highlight the challenges to democracy that we are currently facing and the opportunities that we have to protect it. Mr. President, I am honored to represent New Hampshire, a state that does democracy better than anywhere else. I want to start by talking about one of my favorite New Hampshire events. Shortly after I was first elected governor in 2012, I attended our statewide Veterans Day ceremony at the New Hampshire Veterans Cemetery, a remarkable, serene, beautiful space in the heart of New Hampshire. I had attended that ceremony in the past, but on this particular Veterans Day, I had just days before and for the first time been elected to statewide office to lead and protect my state. My predecessor was also at the ceremony, as were current and soon-to-be members of Congress, members of the current state legislature, and those who had just been elected. New Hampshire had seen a pretty dramatic change at both the state and federal level. 2 Democratic congresswomen had won election, replacing Republicans. The State House of Representatives had flipped from Republican to Democratic control in pretty dramatic fashion. But despite these changes, state and federal elected leaders, veterans and their families, and citizens from all walks of life who wanted to ensure that our veterans knew how much they, the veterans, mattered, were all there. There to celebrate the people, the citizen soldiers who had stepped up in every generation since our country's founding to keep us safe and preserve our democracy so that the rest of us could live in freedom. I've always loved this confluence of Election Day and Veterans Day. On an early Tuesday in November, Americans flood to the polls and cast their votes, expressing their hopes for the state and country that they envision and want to be a part of, confident that they have a voice as stakeholders in our democracy. And then just days later, they join their friends, neighbors, political allies, and opponents to honor our veterans and the principles that they sacrificed and fought for. The foundational idea that every person in our democracy matters and has the opportunity to be included in our civic life. Just days after pitched political battle, as my dad would have said, a war of words, we were together standing united to support those who serve and have served, and in doing so to support the remarkable idea that is the United States of America. This unifying moment, year after year, election cycle after election cycle, didn't happen by accident. It happened because Americans have understood since our founding that the cornerstone of our democracy starts with free, fair, and impartially administered elections. Now, throughout our history, we have failed and then struggled to include and treat equally all Americans. But as we have made progress to acknowledge the full citizenship of all of our people, we have committed to expanding voting access and to protecting an impartial electoral system that ensures the full and fair counting of all votes cast. And the acceptance of the outcome of these elections so that our country could continue to function, grow, become more inclusive, and thrive has been essential, not just for the sake of stability, but for the sake of a democracy in which the government is truly responsive, truly of, by, and for the people. A government so responsive that a constituent, a 9-year-old little girl named Jada, can approach her senator to talk to her about the sadness in her family after a beloved cousin died of an opioid overdose, and expect her senator to take her seriously and work to expand access to prevention and treatment services for those with substance use disorder. A government so accessible that a constituent named Cy can approach his senator at a business in town and thank her for passing the Burial Equity Act, which allows those who serve in the National Guard or Reserve but aren't deployed to be buried in their state's veterans' cemeteries. Cy, like so many of his fellow reservists, volunteered and was ready to answer the call to sacrifice for his country, but was never called up to do so. Artificial bureaucratic barriers prevented his service from being recognized in the same way that other military service is. But thanks to the advocacy of guardsmen and women and reservists, that's now changed. Cy's service is being recognized, and he's being included, as he should be, in the remarkable legion of citizen soldiers who have kept this country free and who can now be buried in a sacred place of honor. Jada's voice counts, so does Cy's. Their experiences, their lives matter, and in a true democracy, so do their opinions and their votes. But the question for Americans today is this: for how much longer will the voices of everyday Americans count? As we all know, in November, in state after state, including in New Hampshire, democracy was on the ballot. There were, in fact, candidates who questioned the sacred right to free and fair elections. Individuals who expressed their willingness to overturn the 2020 election and their willingness to try to reject or overturn election outcomes in the future if their preferred candidate didn't win. I want people to think for a moment about what this means. These candidates were open in their willingness to reject the votes of their fellow citizens, leading to a system in which those in power are unaccountable and therefore unresponsive to the people they claim to represent. In race after race, anti-democracy candidates proposed extreme, unpopular agendas, whether it was eliminating Social Security and Medicare or imposing a nationwide abortion ban, ideas that voter after voter opposes. This disconnect, of course, explains their election denial. In a functioning democracy, the few cannot impose an extreme, unpopular agenda on the many. The only way for these extremists to accomplish their goals is to reject the votes cast by the majority. Mr. President, the welcome news is that in many cases, the American people rejected some of the most vehement election deniers. On a brisk, cold Tuesday this November, Granite Staters, like millions of Americans, once again went to their polling place to cast their vote. They did so not with the expectation that their preferred candidate would win, but rather that their vote, their individual vote, would be counted. They did so at middle schools and town halls, before work and while grabbing lunch, and they did so in New Hampshire in record numbers. Voters recognized the real threat posed by those who would undermine our democracy. They saw the need to reject those who would disenfranchise them. They used their votes and their voices to stop those who would have otherwise jeopardized our democracy. In November, democracy prevailed. But that does not mean that the work is over. We know that while many election deniers lost their races, some won, and some remain in Congress. Those who threaten the integrity of our elections will remain persistent in their efforts, and those who stand on the side of democracy must remain persistent as well. Mr. President, our founders understood just how fragile our democracy is, and the generation of Americans who have followed have understood it as well. And if we are to live up to their example, and if we are to ensure that people like my constituents Jada and Cy are included and can make a difference, Americans must continue to do all that we can to uphold our freedoms and democracy. In Congress, this means that we must continue to fight for access to the ballot box and reinforce a share a commitment to accepting the results of elections. We can do that by supporting legislation like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. And this week we will take an important step forward by passing the Bipartisan Electoral Count Reform Act. And across the country, we must continue to do what the American people did this year, reject those who would end democracy as we know it. If we are truly to remain a government of, by, and for the people, we must stand up and ensure that its foundation of free and fair elections, truly accessible to all eligible voters, remains protected for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from